103. Population are therefore looking for scapegoats for their own misery. The masses take to the streets and demonstrate, cursing our blood is expensive, death to Germany, and boycott German products, ostensibly to show solidarity with the murdered Egyptian woman. This is merely popular anger being used as folk medicine, with the approval of the security forces, in countries where demonstrations are actually prohibited. This energy-sapping battle against windmills distracts from reform debates and helps those in power further consolidate their power. None of these angry demonstrators remembered that many German tourists also died in several terrorist attacks in Egypt. Without the Germans subsequently labeling Egypt a racist country or calling for a boycott. After each terrorist attack, Muslims made it a point to stress that it was an isolated incident and that Islam has nothing to do with violence or terrorism. Why do they now insist on viewing the murder of Marwa al-Sherbini as a collective German guilt? Just a few months before Marwa's death, a 17-year-old French tourist died in a terrorist attack in Cairo. She, too, was a victim of Islamist hatred and racism. But her family mourned in silence and did not. 104. Exploit the case for cultural warfare. Who knows the name of this French student today? Who knows Cécile Van Neer? In February 2010, 2 Egyptian emigrants were killed under strikingly similar circumstances. One died in Milan during a fight with a Latin American teenager, the other was randomly shot by a pubescent Saudi in Saudi Arabia. While the emotional news of the former's death in Milan dominated the headlines in Egypt for days, the other's death received little coverage. Only 2 or 3 newspapers wrote a few lines about the tragic case, very discreetly, as if they were ashamed to link Saudi Arabia with the murder. Wrote Egyptian journalist Hamdi al-Husseini about the media's double standards. It seemed as if the dead man played a secondary role in both cases, and the only important question was where and by whom he was killed. The calls for revenge were also directed only at Italy, while there was hardly any mourning for the Saudi death. This interest in the deceased in Europe came not only from the media, but also from politics. The President of the Senate personally attended only in the first case of the repatriation of the deceased body to Egypt. 105. Muslims in Germany are also trying to capitalize on the Marwa al-Sherbini murder case. Numerous Muslim dignitaries attended the opening of the trial in Dresden. They wanted to put pressure on the already strained, festering German conscience. A Muslim woman has been murdered in Germany. Now we only need 599,9999 victims to be equated with the Jews. Indeed, one cannot help but get the impression that many Muslim intellectuals in Europe, such as the Swiss Islamic scholar Tariq Ramadan, suffer from Holocaust envy. They never miss an opportunity to compare the situation of Muslims in Europe today with that of European Jews in the 19th century or even during the Third Reich. Many have now attempted to exploit the case of the headscarf martyr. Marwa al-Sherbini was renowned with this title after her murder. To curtail freedom of expression in the West and suppress criticism of Islam. In Dresden, the Muslims supposedly only wanted to show solidarity with the victim, with their sister. But where is the solidarity with Muslims who are killed daily in terrorist attacks in Pakistan and Iraq? Where was this Muslim presence in the murder of Haytun Surako, who 106. was murdered in the name of honor by her own brother several years ago in the middle of Germany. Wasn't she also their sister? Wasn't that also her blood? Or is Muslim blood only precious when strangers shed it? Or is the headscarf the dividing line between precious and cheap blood? The victim of Dresden, Marwa al-Sherbini, believed in the German justice system, but her murderer did not. The 28-year-old Russian German withdrew into his narrow, hateful worldview and spun his conspiracy theories. He was unable to confront his own incompetence and projected it onto others, a story we know 1,000 times from the lives of Islamist fanatics. The many Muslims who wanted to honor Marwa with their demonstrations did not follow her path of justice, but in reality, imitated their murderer and, like him, lived in a world full of hate speech and conspiracy theories. Soon, the perpetrator received his just punishment and we all almost forgot about Marwa and her case. Germans returned to boring discussions about tax cuts and the demise of the SPD Social Democratic Party of Germany, German, Sozialdemokratisk. 107. Partei Deutschlands, but Muslims will eventually find a new victim to mourn. Then the usual suspects Wolfgang Bosbach, Otto Schily, and Sem Özdemir will meet again on Anwil's show to explain what's going wrong with integration. Bosbach will repeat that foreigners should learn proper German while Otto Schily will cite examples of successful integration. An angry Islam critic will blame the Turks for everything and a Turkish appeasement romantic will sing her the Green Party's multicultural anthem as a counterargument. The German audience will have fun as always and then go to bed without understanding what's going on. And every time you think things can't get any worse, Sarrazin comes along from somewhere. And there are more and more Sarrazins. Because the Bundesbanker, equivalent to the Reserve Bank of India, is not the problem, he is merely an expression of the fact that we have a problem. He is the messenger of the message that we have a tense culture of debate. Ultimately, the cause of the debates triggered by Thilo Sarrazin, born February 12, 1945, is a German politician or of acts like the horrific murder of Marwa. Therein lies in the fact that in Germany and throughout Europe there is no nuanced debate about Islam and 108. Migration. In this way, populists on both sides succeed in seizing on the issue and exaggerating it. What is missing is an atmosphere in which honest criticism is permissible and one that is free from propaganda, apologetics, and hypersensitivity. For me personally, criticism of Islam today is an expression of Haymanism because Islam harms itself, its followers, and the rest of the world. Islam primarily has a problem with itself and with the interpretation of its role in the modern world. It is running out of time, and we are running out of time. To counter Islam's downward spiral, clear, and sometimes harsh, words are needed. Criticism is needed, but this criticism is far too important to be left to polemics. It is far too important to be left into emotions. It is far too important to be transformed into emotions. Projecting one's own fears onto others does not help, it merely exacerbates the conflict. Perhaps a conversation with someone who disagrees with oneself can be instructive. One should put one's own emotions and fears aside as much as possible. And if Western criticism of Islam seems too polemical to us, we, the Muslims, should take matters into our own hands and exercise this criticism ourselves. 109 Chapter 7 The Cartoon Controversy, or A Conversation with a Heretic. September 30, 2005, was a special day in my life. On that day, I celebrated my wedding to my half-Danish wife in Egypt. Unaware that on the same day something was happening in her hometown of Copenhagen that would open a new chapter in the culture war between East and West. On that day, the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten published 12 cartoons that, a few weeks later, would enrage Muslims around the world. My family, who had always been cordial to my wife, was upset with her country and felt hurt. My wife's Danish relatives were outraged by the enraged Muslims who, in response to the drawings, attacked Danish institutions around the world and burned the Danish flag. 150 people died in the riots. East-West relations were once again in ruins and the culture war had reached my living room. Although I was no longer a devout Muslim at 110. This point, I found some of the caricatures offensive and sympathized with my Egyptian family and fellow countrymen. At the time, I saw no meaning in the drawings other than pure provocation and a lack of respect. 4 years later, I was in the Danish capital and decided to do something no Arab had ever done before. I wanted to speak personally with the man who commissioned the Mohammed cartoons. Flemming Rose is the culture editor of Jyllands-Posten. The name is known in the Arab world, but not the man. People talk and write about him, about his devilish deed, but they don't ask him what he intended. And that's what I wanted to do. I was expecting a serious man accompanied by police. A relatively young man, dressed in sporty clothes, with a cheerful look, arrived on a bicycle. We were sitting in a cafe talking. When I asked him if he had ever spoken to an Arab journalist, he replied in a quiet, shy tone. Only once, someone wanted to interview me about the cartoons, but the whole thing started with a moralizing lecture from him, so I had to end the conversation afterward. That was exactly what I didn't want. I wanted to understand him. Flemming Rose invited me to a 111-second interview in his office downtown, and it went like this: Hamd Abdel Samad, Mr. Rose, some in Europe call you a fundamentalist of press freedom, does that description apply to you? Flemming Rose, it was the then German foreign minister, Joschka Fischer, who named me after the Mohammed cartoons were published in our paper. Some newspapers that opposed the publication of the cartoons then adopted this label. Yes, I am a freedom fanatic, but perhaps not in the way the left-wing press understands it. I uncompromisingly defend freedom of expression because I am firmly convinced that violence begins where words fail. But can freedom of expression be limitless? Of course not. There is nothing that doesn't have borders. We need borders, but I think we have far too many of them in Europe at the moment. We have many taboos and many red lines, and many abuse these taboos to silence others. And I see the cartoon scandal as a beginning for negotiating this issue. I've always seen it as an indicator that has shown us the state of press freedom and self-censorship in Europe. 112 How can we resolve the contradiction between freedom of expression and respect for religious feelings? Who has the right to define red lines, and who has the right to eliminate them? We can make a deal with each other: you respect everything that is sacred to me and don't criticize it, and I'll do the same with their holy sites. That may work wonderfully in theory, but in reality it's almost impossible, because we live in multi-religious and multicultural societies. And if everyone insists that their sacred symbols remain inviolable, then no one can say or write anything. And religious feelings are often abused as a means of intimidation and blackmail, and I oppose that. If we want to live together naturally, then we need fewer red lines, not more. And you, as an Egyptian, know how your president abuses red lines to silence his opponents. You certainly know the activist Saad el-Din Ibrahim, who suffered imprisonment and exile for allegedly damaging Egypt's reputation abroad. You said that violence begins where words fail. What about words that lead to violence? After all, the cartoons cost 150 people their lives. 113. The solution can never lie in laws against insulting religions, but rather in those affected learning to deal with their emotions differently. You can never control how others express themselves, but you can certainly control their reactions. And what about words that incite violence or racism? Hate preacher is a term you must be familiar with. Many consider you one. Here, too, I see no need for anti-hate or anti-discrimination laws. We must always distinguish between words and deeds. Let me give you an example. After we published the cartoons, a group of Muslim protesters stood in front of the Danish embassy in London with a placard reading, "Behead those who insult Islam." From my perspective, they're allowed to do so. But if one of them puts this into action or throws a Molotov cocktail, a kind of hand grenade, at the embassy, which has often been the case, then they must be prosecuted. For me, there are only three limits to freedom of expression, and they are all punishable in Europe. First, direct calls for murder, like saying, "Go and kill Abdel Samad." Second, insulting or defaming a person through 114 lies. And third, violating personal rights. Everything else has to be tolerated. According to this logic, you must also be against the legal persecution of people who deny the Holocaust. Yes, exactly. I even said that in Israel and didn't win any friends because of it. But I believe we don't need laws against certain attitudes or interpretations of history. But if a Holocaust denier calls a Holocaust survivor a liar, that's considered defamation, which can be prosecuted. And just by the way, I'm not Jewish, as some assume based on my name. Let's return to the cartoons. Where did the idea come from, and what were your motives for publishing them? In 2005, a Danish author named Kjær Blutgen wrote a children's book about the Prophet Muhammad and was looking for a cartoonist to create some drawings of the Prophet for his book. Apparently, the Danish cartoonists were afraid of the job, because a year earlier, Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh was murdered by a Muslim fanatic for a film that depicted passages from 115. The Quran on the body of a naked woman. There have been several other cases in which artists and writers in Denmark and across Europe have withheld or withdrawn their Islam-related works for fear of violent reactions from Muslims. Personally, I didn't know whether these cases were always self-censorship out of fear or not, and I wanted to test the mood in Denmark. And so the idea for the cartoons came about. So it was an experiment. I'd rather call it investigative journalism, a long-term observation of the situation and people's moods. There's a principle in our journalistic business that goes, don't tell me the truth, show me it. And what did the publication of the cartoons show? The cartoons didn't create a new situation, but rather made the current situation clearer to us. That there is mistrust and tension on both sides, and that freedom of expression is being pushed back in favor of a policy of appeasement. It was, in fact, self-censorship out of fear of Islamists. And this fear was obviously not without reason, because the reaction to the cartoons in the Muslim world was disproportionately violent. 116. Were you really surprised by these reactions? The whole world was surprised. And these reactions were by no means spontaneous, as many claim. There was political strategy and systematic manipulation behind them. And let me remind you that the demonstrations did not occur immediately after the publication, but after Danish imams had toured the Islamic world with the cartoons, complaining to the authorities there about the mistreatment of Muslims in Denmark, which is simply not true. Incidentally, they also showed other nasty, but fake, cartoons there that did not come from our newspaper, in order to cause more outrage. So, it was a well-considered action. Speaking of deliberate actions and political strategies, malicious gossips claim that the publication of the cartoons was part of a White House plan. The theory goes like this: George Bush needed more funding from Congress for his Patriot Act 2 as part of the fight against terrorism, and the congressmen were opposed to it. So, a crisis needed to be staged to show that America was in danger, which is where the idea for the cartoons came from. This claim was fueled by your presence. 117. In Washington before and after the cartoon controversy. You certainly have arguments to refute this. You know, there are people who are good at nothing more than spreading conspiracy theories, simply because they're incapable of dialogue. It's true that I was in America at the end of 2004, but that was to cover the US elections as part of my job. Even after the cartoons, I was in Washington to stay away from the excitement following the riots. I like being in Washington. After all, I worked there for 3 years as a correspondent for the Danish newspaper Berlingske. Before the cartoons, Denmark's image in the Islamic world as a liberal and neutral country was very positive. Don't you think that you have damaged Denmark's reputation worldwide by publishing the cartoons? Perhaps the world simply had a false image of Denmark. We, too, had previously pointed the finger at France and Germany and criticized their immigration policies. Now it became clear to us that we, too, hadn't done our homework in this regard. The caricatures showed that we are not the exemplary society we would like to see ourselves. 118. And that we have a lot of work ahead of us when it comes to migration and integration. How is the coexistence between Danes and Muslim immigrants in Denmark after the cartoons? Unlike France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, Denmark has no colonial history, and so the experience of emigrants is new to most Danes. Many Muslims who live here also came as refugees, not as guest workers as in other countries, and have enormous difficulties integrating into the education system and the job market. Apart from the imams mentioned above, most Muslims in Denmark reacted relatively calmly to the cartoons. but the tension is there and the gap between native Danes and migrants has now become more apparent, and I hope that the cartoons have sparked an open dialogue aimed at resolving these problems. Are you sometimes afraid? No, I don't. And the proof of that is that I'm not under police protection as many advise me. But my wife is scared, and I understand that. Mr. Rose, have you ever been to an Arab country? 119 Yes, I once attended a blogger conference in Qatar. It was a very interesting experience. If you were invited to give a speech in Cairo to present your point of view, would you accept it? Anytime with pleasure. It was hard for me to imagine that this shy and matter-of-fact Dane with the permanent smile had almost provoked the outbreak of World War III 4 years earlier. I disliked the cartoons and his arguments so much that I wanted to publish the interview in Egypt. Now I understand what Voltaire said about the French disease of intolerance. My attitude toward Fleming Rose was inspired by Voltaire. I don't like your cartoons, but I would give my life so that you can publish what you want. I sent the text to the liberal Egyptian newspaper El Yom El Sabeh, where I have a regular column, and thereby caused a conflict in the editorial office. Although the newspaper proclaimed freedom from censorship, the content of the interview was unacceptable to them. This man sounds so reasonable, the Egyptian newspaper's culture editor told me, expecting a hateful Danish journalist. He was afraid this kind of dialogue wouldn't. 120. Resonate with Egyptians. But he didn't want to lose me as a columnist, because when I was asked to write for the newspaper, I had insisted that my writings would not be censored. We reached a compromise. The interview would appear on the newspaper's website after the end of the holy month of Ramadan, so as not to offend the feelings of the faithful. I agreed. After all, the site is accessed 3 million times a day. When the interview finally appeared on the portal's main page, it was available to read for an hour, then disappeared again. The first comments showed how explosive the mood was among readers. One comment addressed to Rose read, "Think twice before you come to Egypt, because if I see you here, I will eat your liver with my teeth." When I complained to the culture editor about the disappearance of the interview, he claimed it was a technical error. A day later, he moved it to a hidden page before it disappeared for good. In the end, his only apology was, "I'm sorry, it's out of my hands." Chapter 8. 121 No revolution, nowhere, or the Muslim image of God and loyalty to the rulers. The English, French and Russian revolutions were successful because they were able to mobilize the populations against the ruling systems. Since the majority of the population in all three cases were peasants and ordinary workers, they were independent of the system and could therefore overthrow it. Rulers and subjects lived in two separate worlds, and this made revolt possible. A German revolution did occur in 1918. But it failed to reach large sections of the population because German society was too urbanized and the bourgeoisie was heavily dependent on the system's infrastructure. The situation is similar with many Islamic states and their systems of government. Not only because those in power there exercise control over the army, secret service, police, and media, not only. 122. Because the state is the largest employer and has a monopoly on basic consumer goods like bread and gasoline. Muslims everywhere are dependent not only on the state system, but also on the Islamic belief system. And these two have formed a unity since the 13th year of Islam's existence. Rulers and subjects are equally at the mercy of this unity. Both embody a mindset that idolizes authority and condemns revolution. The Prophet Muhammad was a pensive and lonely man, had a certain sensitivity for social issues, and wanted to unleash a social revolution. He disagreed with the pagan rituals and polytheism in his native Mecca in the early 7th century. He dreamed of introducing belief in one God in Arabia and eliminating the idols that surrounded the sacred Kaaba. He was inspired to do this by the Christian and Jewish clergy he met on his many travels as a caravan trader. But he was particularly influenced initially by a Christian monk in Mecca named Waraka, who was a cousin of Muhammad's first wife, Khadija. We find surprisingly little about this monk in the biography of the Prophet, although he apparently played a central role in his life. But Waraka seems to have been deliberately avoided. 123. Nevertheless, what is written there about Waraka raises many questions about the origins of the Quran and the Prophet's ambitions. It was Waraka who married Muhammad to his cousin Khadija, and it was he who convinced Muhammad that he was the prophet of his time after he had visions above a cave outside Mecca. In reality, what was omitted about Waraka tells us more than what is written in the biography. Because no text is also a text. A few years ago, a researcher from Lebanon, writing under the pseudonym Abu Mousa al-Hariri, published a book entitled A Monk and a Prophet, which is now banned in Lebanon. I had to pay more than $100 for a copy of this book during a stay in Lebanon. In this book, the author ventures the thesis that the elderly monk Waraka wanted to establish an Arab Christianity independent of the Hellenized Christianity of Rome and Alexandria. He believed that Jesus was not the Son of God and was in the process of translating a Hebrew gospel into Arabic that differed significantly from the other gospels. Waraka wanted to establish a new Arab Christianity. However, he lacked charisma and energy and was probably too old. He found charisma and energy in the ambitious and 124. Young Muhammad, who enjoyed a reputation as a sincere man and a gifted orator. The visions of the old monk, according to al-Hariri, blended with those of the young, and so did the texts. From this fusion, the Quran, at least in part, emerged. His thesis is supported by a single passage from an earlier Muslim hadith compiler named al-Bukhari, who writes, "Then Waraka died, after which revelation ceased." Indeed, the Quran reports a long period of interruption in revelation, which plunged the prophet into a phase of depression and despair, for he believed God had abandoned him. A German philological study, also by a Lebanese writer writing under the pseudonym Christoph Luxemburg, also assumes that the Arabic text of the Quran contains many Syro-Aramaic words that were known among Arab Christians and in Christian liturgies. Some of these words were not understood by Arabs and were therefore mistranslated. Luxemburg provides the most famous example of this with the word Huri, which is mistranslated in Arabic as the virgin whom the believing man receives as a reward in paradise. In Syro-Aramaic, Huri means white grapes. Bad luck for the suicide bombers hoping to get 72 of 125 them. Luxemburg also assumes that the Quran was based on an original Christian text. Aside from the two theories that many Muslims regard as mere imitations of the Da Vinci Code, the fact remains that the Quran did not originate in a vacuum. It was certainly influenced by its environment and responded to its specific needs. And it is certain that the Quran in Mecca, at least in its early years, was indeed rather Christian in orientation, spoke of charity and patience and was very positive toward Christians, especially monks. As an itinerant preacher at that time, Muhammad never spoke of commandments or prohibitions, but rather of faith, admiration of creation and the unity of God. He reacted rather tolerantly to hostility. When his followers asked him why he treated people who made him ill so well, he said, "Perhaps their descendants will believe in Allah." At that time, he called Jews and Christians believers. He even offered the polytheists of Mecca, "You keep your faith and me my faith." But this attitude was unsuccessful. After 13 years, the number of his followers was very small. Most of them were poor and slaves. This was to change when Muhammad moved from Mecca to Medina. There he established a 126 community modeled on the Jewish tribes who had lived there for generations. While Islam was Christian in Mecca, it became Jewish in Medina. There, the virtues of the law and religious rituals were discovered. The first mosque of Islam was built in Medina. The Jews in Medina lived according to the Jewish law halakha, which means the way. This was the model for a word that still grips the world today, Sharia. This word, quite coincidentally, also means the way. Like the Jews, the Muslims began to fast and chose Jerusalem as their direction of prayer. Also following Jewish precedent, Muhammad forbade his followers from eating pork and having sex with their wives during menstruation. The punishment of adulterers by stoning in Islam can also be traced back to Jewish tradition. An ideology of purity emerged in Medina. In this way, Muhammad wanted to accommodate the Jews so that they would recognize him as a prophet, which would have given his movement a tremendous boost in the Islamization of Arabia. However, the Jewish communities living in Medina kept their distance from him and according to Islamic historiography, even allied themselves with Muhammad's enemies from Mecca, who had 127 expelled him. At this point, a paradigm shift occurred. Initially, Muhammad forbade his followers from alcohol and usury, both to guarantee the independence of the young Muslim community from vices and at the same time to damage the Jews' alcohol and money-lending businesses. Suddenly, the language of the Quran became very polemical and hostile toward Jews. After initially being called believing people of the book, they were now called falsifiers of the book. The hostility escalated to such an extent that the Quran called the Jews children of apes and pigs. 3 tribes were banished from Medina, the 4th was accused of high treason, and, following a verdict from one of Muhammad's companions, more than 600 able-bodied men of the tribe were massacred. Medina was now free of Jews and the direction of prayer was changed from Jerusalem to Mecca. Thus began the cleansing of Arabia project. The peninsula was to be freed of all unbelievers to serve as a base for the expanding Islamic empire. This was the second seed of the downfall of Islamic culture, the obsession with purity. Muhammad never treated his followers like a dictator. He practiced the ancient Arabic principle of 128 Shura, tribal consultation, with them. but they questioned him about all aspects of life and expected him to answer with passages from the Quran or a religious opinion. This gave rise to new surahs that are very different in language and content from the surahs of Mecca. In Medina, the surahs were mostly concrete, didactic, and conflict-laden. The hadiths, the Prophet's extra Quranic sayings, have given rise to the greatest instruction manual in history. Commandments, prohibitions, and recommendations that accompany a Muslim 24 hours a day and in every situation. This makes it difficult for many Muslims to understand the idea of secularization, even today. In contrast to Jesus, who traveled for only a few months as a private preacher, Muhammad's sovereign presence lasted for 23 years, during which he fulfilled the functions of lawmaker, judge, general, and, moreover, prophet. Jesus never had to worry about the material needs of a large community, so it was not difficult for him to say, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." Muhammad could not say such a thing, as he was both emperor and God's postman. The first Christians gained a long experience as a small minority before Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire 3 centuries later. 129 Muslims, on the other hand, came to power very early and with few exceptions, were unknown in their history to the situation of a minority. Islam was built on 5 pillars: first, a de-Hellenized form of Christianity; second, Jewish legalism; third, ancient Arabian tribal structures; fourth, the Quran; and fifth, the jihad. Muhammad emancipated himself from Christianity and Judaism during his lifetime. But his community has not been able to break free from the archaic thought structures of ancient Arabia and the jihad ideology of the Quran to this day. The vision of the Christian monk had failed. Arabs simply think and work differently. Muhammad seemed to have understood this. The relocation of the direction of prayer to Mecca was also a return to an old vision of his great-grandfather, the founder of the Hashemite tribe. Mecca lay on the trade route between Damascus and Yemen. At the center of the city was the Kaaba, the pluralistic religious center of Arabia. Each tribe was allowed to place its deity in or around the Kaaba and visit it during the trading season. Christians were also allowed to hang images of Jesus and Mary inside the Kaaba. This tolerance later became alien to the city. The 130 Prophet's tribe traditionally had the task of entertaining pilgrims, which was a great honor. Even before Muhammad's birth, his grandfather wanted to unite the warring Arab tribes and establish a greater Arabian empire with the Kaaba as its religious center. According to the Egyptian historian Sayyid al-Kimai, the Prophet's grandfather allied himself with the Arab tribes of Medina, which were known as Yathrib before Muhammad's emigration. But his grandfather died before he could realize his plan. His grandson, Muhammad, would now benefit from his grandfather's early alliances in Medina. After the death of the monk Waraka and the failure of the alliance with the Jews, there was a reversal in the Prophet's strategy. He returned to tribal thinking, chose the Kaaba as his center, and integrated the pagan Hajj rituals into monotheistic thought. The principle of blood kinship, however, was complemented by the principle of faith. Muhammad had what his grandfather lacked: a book, the first Arabic book ever. This mixture explains the rapid success of Islam after the return to Mecca. But Muhammad was a different person when he reconquered his hometown. He didn't tell the Meccans, as he had before, you your faith, and me my faith, but destroyed all their deities that stood around the Kaaba, thus planting the 131 seeds of intolerance in the heart of Islam, a disease that this religion has never been able to overcome. A multi-religious center became monocultural. This was also the beginning of the end of this culture. Although he had smashed the stones around the Kaaba, he could never destroy the idols in the minds of the Arabs. The sensitive, pensive hermit in a cave in Mecca had now become a powerful tribal leader who embodied all the contradictions of an Oriental man and shaped the Islamic image of God. A sublime, unpredictable, and angry, yet at the same time kind and merciful God, who always dictates and never negotiates, but soon reveals his generous side. He punishes apostates with the torments of hell, judges over life and death, but cannot be questioned himself. A power-obsessed jealous God who tolerates no other gods alongside him and will walk over dead bodies to assert his power. If one looks at the rulers in the Islamic world today, one discovers astonishing parallels. All refer to the Almighty and have their power blessed by Him. All, like Him, expect absolute loyalty and destroy anyone who questions their power. 132. A comparison between the story of Job in the Quran and the Bible also reveals the different images of God. While the biblical Job quarrels with God over his fate and even describes God as a tyrant who rules over everything, in the Quran he endures one misfortune after another because he trusts in God and His grace. For his patience and humility, he is ultimately rewarded with healing. In general, the tradition of quarreling with God is highly frowned upon in mainstream Islam. You who believe, do not ask questions whose answers would make you sick if you receive them, the Quran, 5/101, states. In contrast to Greek and Northern mythologies, where titans steal fire from the gods to fulfill their dreams, or giants fight against them and dispute their power. This conflict is not allowed in Islam. In Japanese temples, the gods are awakened by humans through a bell. Without humans, there would be no gods. Here, the initiative does not come from the gods, as is the case with monotheistic religions. Rather, man seeks the path to them and determines when these paths diverge. When a Japanese person leaves the temple, these gods do not pursue him with commandments and prohibitions. Man brings the gods to life, not the other way around. 133. The Germanic god Odin has only one eye and is constantly searching for knowledge. He sacrifices himself for humans, not the other way around, and wounded by his own spear, hangs himself from the tree of life, Yggdrasil, for 9 days and nights to gain knowledge. Allah, on the other hand, is not of this world. He is wise and omniscient and sees everything. Even if humans suffer a difficult fate, it has a purpose. He is seen as the creator of humans, who knows how they function, therefore, he is the only one who can dictate their actions. Muhammad died and left behind the Quran and tens of thousands of hadiths containing instructions for all areas of life. Even on how a Muslim should behave in a pleasing manner while passing urine and faces. What he forgot, however, was to tell them who would succeed him and what legitimacy he would need for power. A few years after his death, this led to a heated debate and civil war among Muslims, which culminated in the split of the community into Shia and Sunni. Under the trauma of this split, Sunni Islam became paranoid and developed a pro-ruler ideology to avoid future civil wars. This ideology went so far as to prescribe the duty of every Muslim to obey the 134 ruler, regardless of whether he was immoral or unjust. Slowly, the concept of Hakimiyatullah, or the rule of God, evolved. The idea was not just that God is the only one who can grant or take away power from the ruler, but that he rules on earth through the ruler. Thus, the monarch would be the shadow of God on earth and the executor of his will, an idea also familiar to the pre-Islamic Persians and Egyptians, who had now converted to Islam. This culminated in the concept of the Imam among the Shiites and the idea of the ruler by the grace of God among the Sunnis. The two differ only marginally. And so, especially among Sunnis, there was a consensus that a revolt against the ruler was also a revolt against God, for it opened the way to division and confusion within the Ummah, the religious community of all Muslims. The Quran provides the template for this in two passages. One says, "Be obedient to God, His Prophet, and the commanders among you." The other warns, "Confusion is worse than murder." The Arabic word for confusion, fitna, is the same word for division and seduction by a woman. More on this later. A ruler may, however, be replaced by a new ruler, not by a mass uprising. The Sufi scholars soon agreed that a ruler could seize power through the consensus of the ulama, or scholars, through 135. Inheritance, or through force. The rulers were to work this out among themselves, and the subjects were to submit to the new ruler. This explains why mass uprisings almost never occurred in the Islamic world, apart from a few sporadic revolts against tax increases or food shortages. Muslim rulers, regardless of how they came to power, were always supported by their religious leaders. To this day, part of the Friday sermon in every Islamic country is a prayer for the ruler, "May God be with him." Napoleon, too, recognized this and allied himself with some scholars from the Al-Azhar Mosque to quell the Egyptian uprising. They said, Napoleon was a commander who, according to the Quran, should be obeyed, and it worked. The reinterpretation of religious texts to benefit those in power has a long tradition in the Islamic world. Even in modern times, every ruler, no matter how secular he claims to be, needs puppet scholars who describe everything the ruler wants as Islamic, practical, and good. Thus, in the time of Nasser, who was Marxist-socialist, the scholars declared Islam to be the religion of social justice and of the fighter against exploitation, and Muhammad, long before Marx, as the founder of socialism. When Sadat wanted to open the country to the West and liberalize the economy, Islam 136 suddenly became the religion of freedom of property. Profit maximization was also considered Islamic, as the Prophet himself had been a successful businessman. Al-Azhar even issued a fatwa, a religious opinion, not a murder sentence, as many translate it, declaring bank interest to be Islamic, even though interest is unequivocally forbidden in the Quran. During the war with Israel, Islam was the religion of jihad and the Jews were the eternal enemies of Allah. When Sadat wanted to reconcile with his unloved neighbor, Islam was the religion of peace and forgiveness. In Shiite Iran alone, there have been 2 mass uprisings in the last 30 years. Once, the religious student movement succeeded in deposing the Shah and bringing Imam Khomeini to power, and another time, the masses took to the streets to overthrow Ahmadinejad's rule in Tehran. This is because, as already indicated, Shia Islam itself was born as a revolution and, from its inception, has had no theological reservations about resistance. In Iran, there is also a visible religious power, embodied by the clergy of the mullahs, whereas in Sunni Islam there is no central authority that controls all decisions. 137. The often praised diversity of Islam is often part of the problem, not part of the solution. The adaptability of its theology makes Islam simultaneously a religion of jihad and peace, of the desire for knowledge and the burning of witches. This makes it intangible or untouchable. It's a question of interpretation, is the euphemism used as a defense when one wants to blame Islam for today's misery. This may also be due to the fact that many Iranians still maintain a distance from Islam, maintaining their connection to pre-Islamic Persian culture. This is reflected in the many Persian first names that are not Islamic at all. Ancient Persia still seems to live on in the collective memory of Iranians and in poetry. In the Sunni states, however, Islam managed to leave behind the pre-Islamic period as a time of jahiliyyah, darkness, and ignorance. After converting to Islam, the Persians adopted the Arabic script but retained their own language, which gave them access both to their own history and to Arabic as a language of scholarship in the Middle Ages. The first works the Persians wrote after embracing Islam were the writings of Zoroaster and the epic book Shahnameh, which records the history of ancient Persian kings. The cultural autonomy of the Persians protected them from being absorbed into Arab clan culture. 138. And guaranteed a historical continuity that is unique in the Middle East and perhaps even worldwide. Iranians also have a strong connection to Islamic mysticism, the only movement that allows for conflict with God. On the other hand, mystics reinterpret the things of the world until they once again arrive at God, as Iranologist Bert Fragner emphasizes. Mystical poets such as Rumi and Hafez enjoy almost the same status in Iran as Muhammad. It should be emphasized here, however, that mysticism can also be a kind of opium for the soul, as it can offer a refuge for passive people seeking to escape from reality. A key social difference between Iran and most other Islamic states is that women's education is more advanced in present-day Iran. Bert Fragner sees a civil society and a strong sense of public awareness among Iranians as a good prerequisite for modernization. The role of literature and philosophy in Iranian society cannot be overlooked either. These create a parallel language to the language of authority and put pressure on theology to keep pace. Katajan Amirpur writes in Spiegel's history issue on Persia that the books by Jürgen Habermas and Hannah Arendt on elements and origins of totalitarian rule read differently in Tehran than anywhere else in the world. When 139. Habermas visited Iran in 2002, he was received like a movie star. No wonder theology is much more advanced in Iran than in Sunni states. In 2004, at a conference in Heidelberg, I met the Iranian theologian Abdul Karim Sarash, who distinguished between religion on the one hand and the understanding of religion on the other. According to Sarash, knowledge of religion is not sacred and therefore, like all secular knowledge, is not only open to criticism but also interchangeable. True religiosity only exists in a democracy, for, according to Soros, belief without freedom is no belief at all. It is noteworthy that Soros was one of the leading thinkers of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Today, he is taking a completely different path than the mullah regime in Tehran. Certainly, there are many theologians in Iran who are not only literalists but also offer strange opinions, such as a certain Qasim Siddiqui, who blamed earthquakes on the sins of immoral women. Be that as it may, in both cases Shiite theology remains unaccepted in Sunni states, and the Shiites, who make up only 10% of all Muslims, are regarded by the Sunnis as deviants, or at least as not genuinely Islamic. Iranian exiles in Europe and the USA also play an important role in the difference between Shiite and Sunni reality. Unlike the Sunnis, they in the West. 140. Are not concerned with the size of a mosque or the angle of a minaret, and they do not hide behind the wall of imported identity. Instead, they support the demonstrators in their country both financially and through the media. At the same time, they manage to keep the topic of Iran in the West's consciousness, and a regime overthrow in Tehran gives many Iranians hope that at least the process of change will not be slowed down from the outside, at least not by the West. However, as part of the war on terror, the Western powers forged close alliances with the dictators in the Sunni states. The despots in the Middle East whispered to their allies that there was no alternative to them except the Islamists, the specter that no one in the West wanted. The fact that there are also many secular opposition voices that are more brutally suppressed by the regimes than the Islamists is deliberately concealed. On the contrary, there is a growing rapprochement between despots and holy warriors, both equally irreconcilable toward democracy. A tacit division is emerging: those in power control the resources, the Islamists control the people. An alliance that began in Saudi Arabia more than 200 years ago and is now increasingly becoming a reality in most of the religious states. 141. In Iran, too, people today are rather disillusioned with the theocracy as a utopia. The Islamic Revolution failed to fulfill its promises of milk and honey, and even the living imam cannot perform economic miracles. They saw that the idea of freedom with which the revolution came to power turned out to be a brutal dictatorship. In most Sunni Islamic states where the theocracy has not yet been realized, such as Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan, it is argued that we Muslims have tried all possible models from the West and East. From nationalism to Marxism to capitalism. These systems have not borne fruit in the Islamic world because they were plucked from foreign soil and implanted here, as they did not suit our climatic conditions. Therefore, the Medina Reloaded project remains, as so often, the last resort, a return to the original state model in the time of the Prophet. And so the revolution either fails to materialize or results in a dehumanizing system called Sharia. Chapter 9.